Hey everyone, it's Andy. I just wanted to quickly warn everyone listening that this episode is quite a bit more gruesome and, well, frankly, messed up than other episodes. I've heard that some people listen to the show with their kids or show the podcast to their students, which is just awesome to hear, but if that's the case, or if you're just a bit squeamish about gore or other dark topics in general, you might want to skip this one, because after all, this is a history podcast, and I can't just omit the parts of history that are uncomfortable. Just a warning, let's continue. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we saw the asantehene Osei Bonsu declare war to capture a group of rebellious noblemen who sought refuge in the Fante Confederacy. In the end, Osei Bonsu succeeded in defeating the Fante army, conquering their land, extracting oaths of submission from the Fante elites, and even successfully besieged a British fort. However, he failed to capture one of the rebellious nobles, marking his campaign, at least in his mind, a haunting failure. This episode, Osei Bonsu will try to right the failures of his last campaign, and maintain the successes of his earlier reign, as the fight for sovereignty over the coast is far from over, nor is it the only battle he'll face. Season 3, Episode 14, Gyaaman Must Pay. One day, in late 1807, Osei Bonsu emerged from his home, a tired man. He had been kept awake by an imagined argument between the two royal swords in the room across from him. The sword, which represented the authority of the Ashanti ancestors and royal dynasty, felt that Osei Bonsu had spent too much time dedicated to pleasing the sword of the king, taking it on his conquest of the Fante, and using it to consecrate his capture of the coast. Meanwhile, he had disrespected the sword of the dynasty by failing to capture the criminals responsible for defiling Ashanti graves, and therefore failing to defend the honor of the ancestors. While the sword of the king tried to make a case for itself, it was clear to Osei Bonsu who won the argument. Osei Bonsu, at the end of the sleepless night, was convinced by this epiphanic debate that the problems which the Ashanti faced were his fault. He had spent too much time and effort pursuing glory and ego, and had neglected his responsibility as the protector of Ashanti honor. This would not and could not happen again. However, at least in the meantime, Osei Bonsu had to first deal with the aftermath of his victory. First, despite the war's status as a victory overall, the 1806 war had illuminated numerous flaws in Ashanti military doctrine. Most notably, while the Ashanti had ultimately succeeded in extracting a surrender when they besieged the British Fort William, the lack of experience in siege warfare on the Ashanti's part was evident. Attempts to scale the walls or burn the fort's gate proved not only unsuccessful during the battle, but also extremely costly in lives. Not to mention that the biggest failure of the conflict, the gravediggers' escape from the Ashanti's hands, occurred in part because of the Ashanti's failure to capture Fort William. Sure, they had eventually won the siege from the British running out of supply, but the grave-digging rebel leader had managed to slip out of the fort while Osei Bonsu and the British commander negotiated terms of surrender. So, had the Ashanti been able to capture the fort conventionally, they almost certainly would have caught the fugitive rebel, and Osei Bonsu's victory would have not been tainted by his escape. So, Osei Bonsu knew that, in the future, improved siege tactics were a necessity. But in order for his officers to improve their siege tactics, they would need, something to besiege. Practice makes perfect, after all. So where would the Ashanti army conduct practice sieges? Well, not on European forts, because that could potentially lead to diplomatic misunderstanding if the Europeans, or other nearby people, saw the practice siege without knowing of its intention and believed that war was imminent. Instead, he decided to build a European-style fort of his own. He summoned a group of Ashanti engineers and asked them to reverse engineer the design of the largest European coastal fort, Elmina Castle, and build a simulacrum in Kumasi. Progress started on this castle, called the Abandan, or Stone House, in 1808. The fort was designed to resemble European fortifications down to the last detail, including iron cannons mounted on the walls and the same mortaring techniques. While the full structure wouldn't be complete until around 12 years later, sections of the fort were already constructed by 1810, allowing for Ashanti officers to begin practicing mock sieges and developing new strategies on how to capture forts. If you're interested in knowing how the Ashanti were able to so accurately and quickly reconstruct a fort of such magnitude, as well as how the empire's buildings, roads, and bridges were built, then you'll probably enjoy our latest premium episode, which focuses on the structural, civil, and military engineering of the Ashanti Empire. Like all premium episodes, it can be found on our Patreon. Now, I've recently undergone a pretty big shakeup in my life, involving both employment and education, meaning that continuing to produce this show is becoming more demanding than it's ever been before. So, if you'd like to support the show, or if you'd just like to learn more about Ashanti engineering or any of the other topics our premium episodes have focused on, please go ahead and support us on patreon.com/historyofafrica. And to those already supporting us, thank you. I can confidently say that without your support, the show couldn't have gone this far, so it means a lot. Anyways, back to the show. Osei Bonsu's officers would have little time to conduct mock sieges though. This is because, just as quickly as peace had arrived, war was once again brewing on the southern coast. Despite Osei Bonsu's last conquest of the Fante being a military success, I'd like to immediately make clear that the Fante were not suddenly loyal subjects of the Ashanti Empire. I mean, how could they be? Sure, the Fante had been defeated at Abora and their country had been occupied, but most of its citizens lived on. Remember, these are the same Fante who had such enmity for the Ashanti that they refused to even accept diplomats unless they came in the form of hostages. And that was before the bloody catastrophe of 1806 had inflamed Fante disdain for the Ashantis even further. And in an environment like that, Osei Bonsu had to be crazy to try to directly annex the Fante into the Ashanti Empire and appoint an asantehene as their new leader. So he allowed the Fante Parliament and the King of Makasim to remain the Fante's leaders, so long as they pledged a vassal status to the asantehene. Now, at the start of 1808, the Fante were simply in such a bad position that they had no choice but to nod their heads and act like loyal Ashanti vassals. Their armies had been routed, their towns and cities stripped of valuables, thousands of their people had been taken into slavery, and garrisons of Ashanti soldiers still occupied several crucial points throughout Fantemon. But within just a couple years, the Fante miraculously recovered from their weak position. New generations of boys became men with each passing day, and enlisted into the Asafo militia companies that formed the base of the Fante military. The sheer hatred for the concept of submission to the despised Ashanti further drove recruitment to sky-high levels. By 1809, so soon after their catastrophic defeat at Abora, the Fante once again had a military of both respectable size and armament, and a new Asantehene, or leader of all Asafo companies, was elected the same year. Impressively, just a couple years out after their defeat at the hands of the Ashanti, the Asafo were once again ready to try their luck in a fight. Luckily for the Fante, Ashanti garrisons on the coast were severely depleted. Soon after the occupation began in 1807, a smallpox epidemic broke out among the invading Ashanti, forcing much of the army to return home while many more perished of the disease. Believing themselves ready to initiate a rebellion, the Asafo companies surrounded Elmina, a town on the coast and the site of the infamous Elmina Castle. For centuries, Elmina has been a subject to a complex relationship to the Fante Confederacy. Elmina was, in theory, a province of the Fante, but by playing the Fante and nearby Dutch merchants at the castle off each other, as well as occasionally and recently allying themselves with the Ashanti, the residents had managed to attain a de facto independence from all sides. With Fante morale still damaged from their defeat at the hands of the Ashanti, the Asantehene decided that if there's one thing the Fante could use right now, it was a victory to boost their spirits. Capturing Elmina would not only bolster Fante morale though, it would also serve as a great first step in reasserting Fante authority on the coast and eliminate an important Ashanti ally. As the Asafo company began their assault on Elmina, however, it became very clear that something was different about the Fante this time. While they had the numbers and arms, it was apparent that the new Fante militias were a sad sight compared to their predecessors. And this isn't too surprising. Yes, while the new recruits into the Asafos were valuable in filling the Fante ranks, they were no replacement for the numerous experienced officers and veterans who the Ashanti killed or enslaved at the Battle of Abora. Despite resembling more of an armed and experienced mob than an army, the Fante forces still managed to score a victory at Elmina. The local forces were quickly subsumed, and the city's Dutch garrison was forced to flee behind the castle walls. Unlike the Ashanti, the remaining Fante officers did have previous experience besieging European castles, having already successfully captured Elmina during their war with Osei Bonsu several decades ago. Knowing that the Dutch walls were too high and too thick to scale or break through, the Fante instead opted to camp outside the walls and wait for the Dutch to run out of supplies, the same tactic that had worked in the previous siege of Elmina. The Dutch, desperately lacking supplies even from the very start of the siege, sent a message desperately requesting relief from their ally Osei Bonsu. At this point, Fante leadership had to be well aware that another Ashanti intervention was no longer a matter of if, but when. In 1811, rumors circulated that an Ashanti army was already mobilizing in the north to invade Fante territory, along with their Ga allies in Accra. These rumors were true, by the way, so to give themselves a fighting chance, the Fante decided to launch a preemptive attack against Accra, hoping to knock the smaller party out of the war early. This attack failed. The Fante, apparently, had underestimated the speed of Ashanti mobilization. As the Fante advanced on Accra, which they expected to be lightly defended, they soon came face to face with a large Ashanti army. Osei Bonsu and the Ashanti Minister for War, or conquest, had seen the preemptive attack coming, and had prepared ahead of time to help the Ga defend the city. Meanwhile, with most of the Fante Asafo units tied down in Accra, another Ashanti army was able to march unopposed to Elmina, relieving the Dutch from their siege. After a brief clash at Accra, the Ashanti army, led by Conquest Apiadunka, repelled the undisciplined and inexperienced Fante Asafo. However, if Osei Bonsu and the Ashantis had believed that the Fante hadn't learned anything from their defeat in 1806, they were dead wrong. Rather than consolidating together for a pitched battle like they had at Abura, the Asafo companies instead scattered throughout Fante territory after their defeat. They did not disband, though, and instead continued to fight against the Ashanti in a very different manner. The Asantehene changed his strategy, and instead opted to fight a campaign of asymmetric or guerrilla warfare. Fante soldiers hid in the forests, where they would ambush Ashanti patrols and supply lines before quickly retreating into the thick brush. In urban areas, the militiamen exchanged their uniform for civilian clothing, blended into the local population, and launched sneak attacks before retreating back into the crowds. Compared to the relatively easy mop-up campaign that had followed Abora just a few years prior, this second invasion of the Fante was much more taxing thanks to the Asantehene's ingenious execution of guerrilla warfare. At first, the occupying Ashanti army continued to hold an advantage over the insurgents, keeping their enemies constantly on the defensive. However, after 3 brutal and taxing years of fighting, the tides began to turn. Inspired by the Fante's success at keeping up the fight, the exiled Akyem and Denshira kings urged their own subjects to rise in revolt against the Ashanti, and return to their territories to lead the rebellions themselves. By 1815, the southeastern region of Ashanti influence was in a state of absolute chaos, with Ashanti sovereignty evaporating day by day. The Ashanti position was made even worse by yet another smallpox outbreak in their ranks. As the war expanded and its casualty numbers and costs continued to rise, Ashanti frustrations also grew. Namely, many within the Ashanti military were confused as to how the Fante, previously so thoroughly defeated, with so many of their weapon caches seized, could have possibly re-equipped an army so quickly. Sure, domestic gun manufacturers existed all over Ghana, but the Fante economy was nowhere near large enough to produce such an impressive supply of firearms. It's almost as if someone from outside had been selling them weapons. Almost immediately, one suspect stood out from the others: the British. The British, while theoretically being neutral and having pledged subservience to the Ashanti, possessed deep diplomatic ties with the Fante. In previous decades, nobody would have batted an eye at the British selling Fante weapons, as pretty much all European mercantile companies sold to every African kingdom in the region. But after the 1806 war, things had changed. The Ashanti had assumed that, by pledging subservience and allegiance, the European merchants on the coast agreed to treat the Ashanti as exclusive partners in the firearms trade. And, in the case of the Dutch and Danish, this expectation had been fulfilled. So when reports began to emerge of captured Fante soldiers carrying British rifles, the Ashanti military leadership was very unhappy. Anglo-Ashanti hostility came to a head in 1814, when an Ashanti army confronted the governor of the Company of African Merchants in a coastal town of Winneba, home of a British fortress by the same name. While it's not clear how exactly fighting first broke out, or what either side sought to gain from the encounter, fighting broke out regardless. The British, likely aware of stories of the Battle of Anamabo, were confident that the Ashanti lacked the capability to quickly capture forts. Well supplied in Fort Winneba, they could certainly hold out long enough to wait for reinforcements. So, I imagine the governor was terrified when the Ashanti outside showcased just how much their siege tactics had improved in the last 7 years. Showcasing well-coordinated and disciplined attacks, the Ashanti managed to keep the fort's defenders under constant pressure. These non-committal, probing attacks baited the fort's garrison into consuming high quantities of gunpowder. If the defenders didn't bite, the Ashanti pushed closer and closer to the walls until the British began to open fire before they retreated. After hours of aimlessly returning fire at the Ashanti's mobile and well-coordinated attacks, the British gunpowder stores ran dry, allowing the Ashanti to close in and begin scaling the walls with little resistance. Crucially, there was no surrender at Winneba. The fort was captured and the governor inside was executed. The message that this battle sent to the British was understood loud and clear. Selling weapons to the Fante was a bad idea, and it became British policy to avoid selling to anybody but the Ashanti. As the brutal asymmetric fighting continued into 1815 and 1816, Fante weapons and ammunition supplies began to deplete. Exhausted and out-attrited by their Ashanti enemies, the Fante were once again forced to agree to a humiliating vassalage. With the Fante now defeated, the Ashanti now turned their full might onto the Akyem and Denshira, who, now outnumbered by a significant margin, were crushed with ease. The rebellious kings were executed, and new, more subservient kings were appointed in their place under the strict supervision of Ashanti Amanhenes. These wars, which went down in history as the Gyaaman War and the Fante and Akyem War, or sometimes the Ashanti Akwapim War, were concluded. Even the British, defeated by the Ashanti in battle twice now, were once again forced to the table to sign a treaty with the Ashanti. The 1817 Anglo-Ashanti Treaty, signed by Osei Bonsu and a representative of the British Company of African Merchants, settled many issues of disagreement between the kingdom and company. The British admitted fault in the previous incidents at Winneba and Anamabo, and formally apologized for any misgivings between the two kingdoms. Additionally, the British resolved the question of criminal fugitives, which had proved so important in provoking the battle at Anamabo in the first place, pledging to extradite any fugitive criminals to the Ashanti.
The Governor-in-Chief reserves to himself the right of punishing any subject of Ashanti guilty of secondary offences, but in case of any crime of magnitude, he will send the offender to the king, to be dealt with according to the laws of his country.
Finally, and most importantly, they also confirmed their commitment to free passage for Ashanti merchants, and once again conceded Ashanti sovereignty over the British coastal forts, and acknowledged the Fante's status as a subject of the Ashanti. The treaty stipulated, though, that the Fante would remain as a dependent but separate nation from the Ashanti, and that the British were allowed to continue trading with this dependent Fante state, though only during periods of peace. But somehow, even after 2 wars with the Fante, and the ink still wet on multiple peace agreements with his foes, Osei Bonsu's tumultuous foreign policy didn't end here. All the way on the other side of the Ashanti Empire, a new conflict was brewing. The Ashanti's oldest enemies, the Dorma, will once again face the Ashanti in battle. So, what exactly has been going on with the Dorma since we last saw them 9 episodes ago? Last time we saw the Dorma, that is, the Akan kingdom just to the west of Kumasi, they had killed the king of Gyaaman, Obiri Yeboah, in battle, only to be defeated soon after by who else but Yeboah's nephew, a somewhat important guy by the name of Osei Tutu. But since then, the Dorma have been, well, dormant. But for real, they've been quiet for a while. Well, until today, the Dorma have remained the only Akan polity to remain completely independent of the Ashanti. They've sent them the occasional tribute payment, but no more. In fact, not only have they been surviving Ashanti ambitions, they've been doing very well, even expanding into somewhat of an empire of their own. You see, after Opokuware's conquest of the Bono state all the way back in, episode 6? That northwestern region that sits just outside of Ashanti influence has been going through a whole lot of change. Just outside the reach of Ashanti frontiers, there existed one final unconquered major Bono city, the trade hub of Bonduku. Bonduku was the 3rd largest Akan city, surpassed in 1811 by only Kumasi and Mankasim in population. And sometime in the early 18th century, the Dorma under the leadership of Dormahene Tandate expanded north, eventually enveloping Bonduku and its neighboring regions, populated by the Muslim Mande-speaking ethnic group, the Jula. Well, they were sort of an ethnic group, sort of an economic class. It's complicated, definitely future podcast season material. Anyways, perhaps to prevent rebellion, Tandate did not frame this campaign as a conquest by the Dorma, but rather as an integration of multiple ethnic groups into a shared state. Throughout its history, this state, known as Gyaaman, would remain overtly multi-ethnic, with Dorma, Bono, Jula, as well as the empire's minority Guang populations, each holding various positions of power throughout the kingdom's existence. Through the 18th century, Gyaaman gradually solidified itself as a great power on the border of the Northwest Forest and Northern Savannah regions. While the empire's permanent population, barely greater than 200,000, was dwarfed by their Ashanti neighbors, the Gyaaman kingdom used its strategically important position as a trade route between the Ashanti and Sahelian kingdoms to wield considerable economic power, far more substantial than its small size would normally allow. Now, Gyaaman had clashed a couple of times in small skirmishes with the Ashanti before, but never had the Gyaaman fought a full-fledged war against their enemies to the south. The origins of the coming conflict between the Ashanti and Gyaaman date back to around 1810, just as tensions were also heating up in the south. That year, a new Gyaaman-hene rose to the throne, a man named Kwadwo Adinkra. Those of you subscribed to our Patreon might remember that name as the guy falsely attributed as the origin of Adinkra symbols, while in reality the name is almost certainly a coincidence. Adinkra was notoriously a non-ambitious king. He was content to rule the Gyaaman, as many kings before him had, as a prosperous secondary power that didn't challenge Ashanti dominance. In fact, Gyaaman kings had regularly paid the asantehene tribute since the rule of Osei Kwadwo, and Kwadwo Adinkra was perfectly content with this situation. But while Adinkra was content to rule an unambitious secondary power, His sister, of all people, was definitely not. Going by the name Amatamia, Adinkra's sister was a polar opposite of her brother. While he had a reputation for being easygoing, if a little socially awkward, Tamia was a confident speaker and known for dominating any social gathering she partook in. Notably, she was also notoriously ambitious, not wanting to settle for maintaining the status quo, but desiring to advance her and her kingdom's power further than ever before. And due to this strong personality, many of the elites of Gyaaman viewed the strong-willed Amatamia, and not her brother, as the true power behind the Gyaaman stool. Speaking of the Gyaaman stool, it's going to play a pretty big role in our story. Like every other Akan kingdom or polity, Gyaaman royal power was encapsulated by a wooden chair, or stool. The sole exception to this is, of course, the Ashanti, who, in a symbol of their supremacy among Akan states, used a stool coated in gold. At Tamia's urging, and against her brother's wishes, the royal family of Gyaaman hired a team of artisans to gild the Gyaaman royal stool in 24-karat gold. While this may seem to us like a mere change in aesthetics, the symbolism behind this change was as overt as it gets. Coating the Gyaaman stool in gold was a diplomatic middle finger to the Ashanti. It was, essentially, an announcement that the stool of Gyaaman deserved the same respect and commanded the same power as their neighbors, and that the Ashanti were not without equals. It also implied that, as an equal, Gyaaman would not continue to pay tribute. Upon hearing this news, Osei Bonsu was infuriated. Not only was the Gyaaman monarchy insulting him and his power, they were insulting the golden stool itself, the sacred symbol and home of the spirits of the Ashanti ancestors. Osei Bonsu, of course, had pledged to protect the honor of these Ashanti ancestors. This could not stand. The asantehene debated his next move. While Tamia's gilding of the Gyaaman stool was certainly provocational, the asantehene was apprehensive about the idea of attacking a kingdom that had, until recently, not only provided the Ashanti with tribute, but a stable, friendly northwestern frontier. So, rather than immediately declaring war, Bonsu decided instead to opt for diplomacy. He and an aide traveled to Bonduku to speak with the Gyaaman hene. When they arrived in 1818 and confronted Adinkra, alone in his palace, he sheepishly surrendered the Gyaaman stool to the Ashanti envoy. Satisfied, Bonsu and his aide returned to Kumasi. Later that day, Tamia returned to the Gyaaman palace and, enraged at her brother's capitulation, arranged for the construction of a new Gyaaman golden stool. When word arrived of the crafting of a new golden stool in Gyaaman, Osei Bonsu, thoroughly fed up with the Gyaaman royalty, sent yet another envoy to Bonduku. This time, Tamia was present at the Gyaaman palace. When the Ashanti envoy demanded she surrender the golden stool and pay a punitive indemnity of gold for the trouble she had caused, Tamia laughed at the diplomats and responded with some strong language.
You impotent tortoise. If it's gold you want, perhaps I can vomit some up for you, or maybe shit it out in your king's hands.
Adinkra, always non-confrontational and also present at the meeting, sat idly by in the corner. At one point, the Ashanti envoy, attempting to convince Tamia to give in, noted that her brother had already surrendered the stool not so long ago, so why couldn't she do the same? Tamia responded by lashing out at her brother.
God, despite his wisdom, made a mistake when he created myself and my brother. For my cowardly and terrified brother, he should have been given the genitals of a woman. But I am fierce in spirit and freedom, ardent and manly. What a terrible mistake which God has tasked us to correct with our own human skill. I swear to be resolute. I swear to my brother, who sits silently in the corner, that I will amputate his genitalia and mount it to the top of my parasol, so that your Ashanti king will see it and understand it as a declaration of war. We will give all that we have to fight the Ashanti. This is what the men of Gyaaman are like.
Well, you can't get a much stronger response than that. I mean, what do you even say to something like that? Apparently, the Ashanti envoys couldn't decide what to say either, and, speechless, they returned to Kumasi. Knowing of Amatamia's reputation, Osei Bonsu had been expecting a response like this, because he broke out into laughter when the envoys repeated back what had happened, and noted that this was the response proper of the Gyaaman king's sister. Regardless, it was obvious that war was inevitable. Each side took a year to prepare. Tamia used her kingdom's vast wealth to raise soldiers not only from her own people, but also numerous mercenaries from the Sahel. Apparently, she also hired a group of bards and singers to entertain the soldiers as they coalesced at the capital. Both sides also invoked the supernatural to aid them in the coming war. Osei Bonsu, inspired by his failures in the First Fante War, wanted to ensure that the ancestors blessed him with good fortune. Apparently, he rescheduled every single criminal execution to take place on the same day, and became temporarily more punitive in his criminal sentencing to ensure a bigger sacrifice. Meanwhile, Kwadwo Adinkra tried to use a pair of rams to predict the future. He brought a pair of rams outside his palace, designated one ram to be named after himself, and the other after Osei Bonsu. He then provoked the rams to fight. The ram he named after himself emerged the victor, making the Gyaaman king confident in his coming victory. In 1819, an army of Ashanti soldiers and a supporting cadre of Dagomba mercenaries, combining to an impressive number of 100,000 men, marched on the main road to Bonduku. This was the largest single army ever assembled in Ashanti history. If the Ashanti were expecting an easy victory against the outnumbered 40,000 Gyaaman soldiers they faced, such a victory would never arrive. Early in the invasion, Ashanti scouts skirmished with Gyaaman forces, with neither side emerging as a clear winner. Then, one day, on the banks of the River Tyne, the Ashanti force came face to face with their enemy. Adinkra and Tamia, leading the Gyaaman army themselves, knew that the Ashanti army was designed to be mobile, its strategy relied on encirclements, and that its ranks outnumbered that of their own soldiers. But, having planned ahead, they decided that the Tyne River was the perfect place for them to mount their defense. Most of the river was too deep, and its flow far too strong for the Ashanti to try to cross. The only point of the river that could be realistically crossed was a single narrow stretch of shallow and gentle water, meaning that it would be impossible for the Ashanti's larger army to encircle the Gyaaman force. As the Ashanti forward guard advanced through the shallow section of the river, the Gyaaman's best soldiers marched forward to meet them. The river's waters ruined any gunpowder the soldiers carried, so fighting immediately devolved into a bloody melee. Throughout the bloodbath, Ashanti forces tried to push through the Gyaaman center as they slowly waded towards their enemy through the river. With each drive forward, the Ashanti gradually chipped away at the Gyaaman lines and advanced in a slow trudge. However, each time the Ashanti seemed close to victory, and their forward guard approached the river's edge, the soldiers on the riverbank would pelt them with volleys of gunfire. Ashanti morale would then collapse and the forward guard would retreat, erasing their hard-fought gains in seconds. After 2 failed attempts, the conquest realized that he was running low on manpower in the forward guard, and the 3rd crossing attempt would have to succeed, or the battle could be lost altogether. On the 3rd attempt to fight their way to the end of the river, the Ashanti forward guard lurched incredibly close to the riverbank. As they approached the bank, though, again, Gyaaman soldiers peppered them with bullets. While they continued to advance slowly, it was clearly just a matter of time until their morale shattered. Knowing that his troops needed one last push to break through, the conquest and his assistant officers leapt into the river to fight alongside their comrades. Allegedly, this show of bravery rejuvenated the Ashanti morale, and the tide of battle was turned. As the Ashanti forward guard reached the other side of the Tyne and established a bridgehead, the rest of the Ashanti army managed to cross the river. Meanwhile, the Gyaaman army retreated down the road to the town of Nkoranza. At this town, with no river to halt their advance, the Ashanti could practice the type of fast-paced, encirclement-based warfare they were comfortable with. At Nkoranza, the Gyaaman army was thoroughly destroyed. Both Tamia and Adinkra were killed during the battle. The details of Adinkra's death, while not particularly relevant, are just too unbelievable, gory, and, well, just weird not to share. So, yeah, if you don't like gore, remember my warning from the beginning. Now, there are 2 versions of events, one told by the Ashanti and the other told by the Bono and Dorma. Both are, strange to say the least. In the Ashanti version of events, the cowardly Kwadwo Adinkra tried to flee from his defeat at Nkoranza. But as his army crumbled around him, he knew that the Ashanti would recognize him without a disguise. So, thinking on his feet, he apparently cut off the face of one of his fallen comrades, and attempted to wear it as a disguise as he fled. Somehow, the brilliant strategy of wearing bloody human skin as a disguise didn't work, and he was caught almost immediately. The Gyaaman king was then brought to Kumasi, where Osei Bonsu executed him himself, and kept his skull as a trophy. According to the Gyaaman version of events, Adinkra was never captured at all, but chose instead to die honorably by suicide after his defeat. Shortly after his father's suicide, Adinkra's son, while fleeing the battlefield, encountered the corpse of his father. Adinkra's son decided that he didn't want his dad's head to be cut off and taken back as a trophy to Kumasi. So he came up with a brilliant hiding spot. He cut off his dad's head, found the nearby body of a pregnant woman, performed a rudimentary C-section on her corpse, hid his father's head inside her womb, then stitched the woman's corpse back up. Obviously, this plan failed. As Ashanti soldiers walked by the scene, one of them noticed a headless body covered in expensive jewelry. Then they saw this poorly stitched up body of a pregnant woman with a face-shaped bulge in her stomach and thought, that's weird. So they unstitched the dead woman, and wouldn't you know it, there's a head. The son was captured not long after and confirmed that, yes, this was the head of his father, Kwadwo Adinkra. The son was taken back to Kumasi and executed, while despite his son's best efforts, Kwadwo Adinkra's head was brought back to Kumasi as a trophy. Yes, that is the official Bono version of events. Yeah, there's been some strange stuff on the show before, but never anything this strange. Anyways, back to normal history land. After their decisive victory at Nkoranza, the Ashanti army went on a rampage throughout Gyaaman territories. Multiple towns were wiped off the map entirely, while reportedly 100,000 people, almost half the population of the kingdom, were taken into slavery. Valuables from Gyaaman's royal palace were melted down into gold and transported back to Ashanti. In the most potent display of Ashanti power, a statuette of a soldier in the Gyaaman palace, meant to act as a protective symbol, was melted down and crafted into a bell. This bell was placed on the Ashanti golden stool, so that the king's ancestors could ring it to warn him of impending danger. The message of this campaign of destruction was clear. The victory over Gyaaman was so total that not only did it force the Gyaaman into a permanent state of submission, it basically ensured that Gyaaman would never again be able to challenge the Ashanti. The kingdom would remain a semi-independent Ashanti vassal, but a new, pro-Ashanti king was placed as its ruler, and tribute payments were escalated from rare to constant. But most importantly, at least to Osei Bonsu, he had defended the honor of his kingdom and his ancestors. Gyaaman had paid for their insult to the golden stool, and had been reduced to a status of subjugation and ruin. There was no catch this time. Osei Bonsu's goal had been unquestionably achieved and then some. Finally, he could sleep peacefully. And, at least for now, the Ashanti Empire, too, was at peace. This period, the tail end of the rule of Osei Bonsu, will go down in history as the height of Ashanti power and prosperity. So, next episode, we'll take a break from our stories of kings, conquests, reforms, and revolutions to just pause and take a stroll in this empire at its height. Join us next episode as we learn more about what life was like not for the asantehenes, but for the average working class Ashanti subject. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like the show and the free education we provide, then I'd encourage you to support the show. This can be done by a monetary donation to our Patreon, which can be found on our website, historyofafricapodcast.blogspot.com, by giving the show a review on iTunes, or by sharing the podcast to anyone who you think might be interested. This episode was brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including the Caltech Sovereignty Club, Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Kevin Johnson, Morgan Blackmore, Emmanuel Zaude, Sarah Mpenza, Tobias Tungland, and Dimitri, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really means a lot.